What's going on, family? This is Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I want to talk about 1978. What a year that was for boxing. You see, there was a heavyweight championship bout that took place between Larry, the Eastern Assassin Holmes, and Kenny Norton. Perhaps one of the greatest heavyweight championship bouts known to man. Most definitely the 15th round. Perhaps the round of the century. You had a light heavyweight championship bout that took place in 1978. And I was fortunate enough to be in the third row of that fight. It was at the Philadelphia Spectrum between Yaki Lopez and Matthew Saad Muhammad. And I got to tell you, 80% of the spectators there that night were in tears. Not a dry eye in the house. Because if you knew Matthew Saad Muhammad's story, and you witnessed the 8th round live at ringside, you would understand my point. Study Matthew Saad Muhammad. Look into his story. And then take a look at that fight. Unbelievable. You had the policemen and the vending guys selling candy and popcorn, giving each other high fives. They were eating popcorn, feeding each other popcorn. Ladies and kids, everyone was crying walking out of that arena. Unbelievable because of the passion. One of the greatest light heavyweight championship bouts I've ever witnessed. Also at the Philadelphia Spectrum that year, you had Marvelous Marvin Hagler and Bad Bennie Briscoe. What a fight that was. And I was fortunate enough to be at the second row of that fight. Quick side note, you also had James Scott, Galway State Prison, and Eddie Mustafa Muhammad. That fight took place in 1978. And that was a very good fight. It was on television. Muhammad Ali, Leon Spinks. You had a lot of great fights in 1978. And that was an outstanding fight. But Bennie Briscoe and Marvelous Marvin Hagler, I want to get into that fight with you. But I want to do it right here on the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. Let's take a look at their profiles and their careers. Now, Bad Bennie Briscoe was born in Augusta, Georgia. That would be the hometown of the late great lightweight champion, Bo Jack. Bennie Briscoe was born February 8th, 1943. He died Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, December 28, 2010. He was 67 years of age at the time of his death. He stood 5 foot 8 inches and he weighed 146 to 168 pounds. He had total bouts of 69 fights, 66 wins, 53 knockouts, 24 losses, and 5 draws. Now, Bennie Briscoe was one of 14 children. He graduated from Simon Gratz High School. And it was at that high school that he played football and ran track and field. And he was actually very good at it. But Bennie Briscoe and his family moved from Augusta, Georgia to Philadelphia to brotherly love when he was 16 years of age. And it was at that point when he decided to take up the game of boxing. You see, Philadelphia was a boxing town. You had great fighters such as Smoking Joe Frazier, Georgie Benton, Matthew Saad Muhammad, Bobby Green. Unbelievable fighters at that time. Joey Giardello and a lot of great fighters were still around at that time. But it was a fighting town. So he was adopted into the gyms. And he would win the Diamond Belt Championship belt in 1962 in Philadelphia. He had an amateur record of 70 wins and 3 losses. Bennie was rated the top 100 greatest punches by the prestigious Ring magazine. He was a top-rated middleweight contender during the 1970s. He won the U.S. National Championships as a welterweight in 1962. He was a 3-time middleweight champion in the Middle Atlantic AAU competition. He fought very good fighters, such as Stanley Haywood. He would lose to him. He fought him December 6, 1962, but Stanley Haywood had a fighting career record of 20 wins, 2 losses, and 1 draw. He would face Charlie Scott March 9, 1964. He would defeat Charlie Scott. Scott came in with a fighting career record of 34-27. Fought him at the Philadelphia Spectrum. Knocked him out. He would face Sweet Georgie Benton, an outstanding #1 ranked middleweight for 3 years. Fought him December 5th, 1966. He would defeat Georgie Benton. And that's what put him on the map. You see, Georgie Benton was the king of the shoulder roll. And he added the shell to that shoulder roll. He would get that from Archie Moore. And Benton had a fighting career record coming into that fight, 54-11-1. Fought him at the Philadelphia Arena. March 20th, 1967, he would face future middleweight champion Luis Rodriguez. Now Rodriguez would have a fighting career record of 76-6-0. And he would fight at the Philadelphia Arena. He would defeat Bennie Briscoe. May 6, 1967. Bennie Briscoe would face Carlos Monzon. Fought him in Luna Park, Buenos Aires. Carlos Monzon had a fighting career record coming into that fight at 43-6. He won 40 fights, lost 3, had 6 draws. Bennie Briscoe would lose that fight, but he would be coming off of hepatitis. He would be recovering. And there was some allegations of some low blows that was thrown at Bennie Briscoe and bad officiating and so on and so forth. But that would be the closest opportunity for Bennie Briscoe to become middleweight champion in the world. Why? Because it was a draw. So 1 point either way would make a decision. And it was said they didn't want Carlos Monzon to lose, so they made it a draw. August 18, 1975, he would defeat Eddie Mustafa Muhammad. Eddie Mustafa Muhammad would face Michael Spinks for the light heavyweight championship of the world. He would win the title himself. But he came in that fight with a fighting career record of 13-1-1. Fought him at the Philadelphia Spectrum. I'm quite familiar with that location, because I witnessed 3 fights at the Philadelphia Spectrum. And like I said, I was at the fight between Yaki Lopez and Matisab Muhammad at the Philadelphia Spectrum. The fight we're talking about now, Bennie Briscoe and Marvin Hagler. Marvin Hagler was at the Philadelphia Spectrum. Great fights at that arena. October 9th, 1974, Bennie Briscoe would face the 5-time champion, middleweight and welterweight, Emil Griffith. Griffiths had a fighting career record coming into that fight of 78-16-1. Fought him at the Philadelphia Spectrum. And Briscoe would lose 1 and have a draw with the great Emil Griffith. What an accomplishment. November 18th, 1975, and April 6, 1976, he would face Eugene Hart. Hart had a fighting career record coming in at 28-5-0 and 29-5-1. Fought him both times at the Philadelphia Spectrum. Bennie Briscoe would win 1 and have 1 draw with Eugene Hart. They called him Eugene Cyclone Hart. Very good fighter. Bennie Bennie Briscoe would face Vito Antuofermo. Vito Antuofermo would become middleweight champion of the world. He had a fighting career record coming in at 43-1. 40 wins, 3 losses, 1 draw. Fought him at the great Madison Square Garden, one of the greatest arenas in boxing history. He would lose to Vito Antuofermo, but as I said, Vito Antuofermo would become middleweight champion of the world. Now, Bennie Briscoe, like I said, faced Carlos Monzon for the middleweight championship of the world, WBC and the WBA, November 11th, 1972. Carlos Monzon had a fighting career record coming into that fight of 77-3 with 9 draws. So it'd be 77 wins, 3 losses, and 9 draws. November 5th, 1977, in Italy, Bennie Briscoe would face Rodrigo Valdez for the vacant WBC WBA World Championship in middleweight division. He would come up short. But you had some fighters who just had that kind of luck. They would always come up short when it came to the big fights. But Bennie Briscoe was no journeyman as far as I'm concerned. He was a hell of a fighter. And when he fought Marvin Hagler at the Philadelphia Spectrum, the thing that got me the most, and I was in the second row, and I was a kid at that time. After Marvin Hagler defeated Bennie Briscoe, he would grab the microphone and he would call out another Philadelphia fighter. His name was Ronnie Harris. You see, Marvin Hagler wanted smoke with the Philadelphia fighters. He was in there with Boogaloo Watts, Caveman Lee. He was in there with Wilfred Scipio. He wanted Ronnie Harris. If you had a name, he wanted to know about it. He faced Sugar Ray Seals twice. Marvin Hagler was some fighter. I have him the greatest middleweight. Along with Harry Greb and Sugar Ray Robinson. Bernard Hopkins can take a seat a little bit, and he understands that. But Bernard Hopkins was a very, very good middleweight. One of the best of all times, absolutely. But Carlos Monzon and Harry Greb, marvelous Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Robinson, Harry Smith, these are great middleweights. But Marvin Nathaniel Hagler had his name legally changed in 1982 to Marvelous Marvin Hagler. He was born May 23, 1954 in Newark, New Jersey. He stood 5 foot 9.5 inches and he had a 75-inch reach. He had total bouts of 67 fights, 62 wins, 52 knockouts, 3 losses with 2 draws. He fought from 1973 to 1987. He was the undisputed middleweight champion from 1980 to 1987. Marvin Hagler was the second longest undisputed middleweight champion behind Tony Zale. 12 consecutive defenses. 6 years and 7 months. Now let me explain that. Marvin Hagler was the second. But it could have been, with a good argument, the first, because Tony Zale couldn't fight for a few years because of the war. So his title wasn't on the line. He had 3 great wars with Rocky Graziano. He fought Georgie Abrams. But the NBA came from Al Hastacker. And Tony Zale went to the body like nobody's business. But when I tell you the names that Marvin Hagler had faced in defense of his title and working his way up to the title, you'll understand. Marvin Hagler was also the highest KO percentage of knockouts as an undisputed middleweight champion. So let's make sure we understand this. not just a champion, WBA or an IBO or WBO, the undisputed middleweight champion for 7 years. He had the highest knockout percentage. No one has ever done it. So he holds that distinction. He was named the Fighter of the Decade 1980 twice. Named Fighter of the Year by the prestigious Ring magazine. Named 4th greatest middleweight champion of all times. He was 17th greatest fighter in the past 80 years. 2001-2004 greatest fighter by the Writers Association. He fought Hall of Fame champions such as Sugar Ray Leonard, 1987, very controversial loss on behalf of marvelous Marvin Hagler. Roberto Duran, who was a lightweight all the way to the super middleweight champion. Thomas the Hitman Hearns, perhaps the greatest middleweight championship bout, took place in 1985. It's disputed between Tony Zale and Rocky Graziano. He would face Vito Antuofermo in 1979 and in 1981. Fought him twice. 1979, it would be a draw. Marvin Hagler would be very disappointed. Because that same year, in 1979, Sugar Ray Leonard would face Wilfredo Benitez. Or I should say Wilfred Benitez. And that would be for the WBC Welterweight Championship. And Marvin Hagler always felt as though he would be overshined. He felt injustice that title was taken away from him because Ray Leonard was fighting the same night and he was winning the welterweight championship belt. That's Marvin Hagler's concern. He would face John the Beast Mugabe. I was at that fight. 1986, Las Vegas. Unbelievable 6 rounds of boxing. On that same card, you had Thomas the Hitman Hearns and James Black and Gold Schuler. Unbelievable first round straight hand knockout. And you had Gaby Canizales. I'll tell you, Gaby Canizales with an unbelievable right hand punch. You know, that night was unbelievable. And I was fortunate enough to have the 5th row of that fight. It was cold and rainy and it was just some fight that night. Takes me back, I'll tell you. He faced Alan Mentor in 1980. And that's when he got the middleweight championship belts. But unfortunately for Marvin Hagler, chairs and everything were thrown at him. And Alan Mentor had made some racial slurs. And it seemed like Marvin Hagler just couldn't catch a break. But he would win the title that night. He would defend his title against Tony Simpson. I was at that fight. Mustafa Hamshaw. I was at that fight, Madison Square Garden. What a beatdown Mustafa Hamshaw received. He faced Sugar Ray Seals twice. I was at one of those fights. And Marvin Hagler defeated Bennie Briscoe. I remember the sound of those punches that were being thrown and landed. Bennie Briscoe could take a punch. He was the hometown hero. It was his last stance. And these two men went at it. And Marvin Hagler boxed from left to right, right to left. And Bennie Briscoe was the slugger. He stalked Marvin Hagler. And Marvin Hagler switched righty to lefty. Majority southpaw. And he would win a 10-round unanimous decision. And at the end of that fight, Marvin Hagler would grab the microphone and call out another Philadelphia fighter, Ronnie Harris. And he said that Ronnie Harris had a big mouth and he wanted smoke with Ronnie Harris. And that's why I respect Marvin Hagler. He's an unbelievable middleweight champion. Perhaps the greatest of all times. Now in that Marvin Hagler, Bennie Briscoe fight, they fought August 24th, 1978 at the Philadelphia Spectrum. Now the first judge was John Stewart. He had to fight 47 for Hagler and 44 for Bennie Briscoe. Paul Harris, 49 for Hagler, 43 for Briscoe. And referee Tommy Reed, 48 for Hagler and 43 for Briscoe. Bennie Briscoe was ranked number 5 by the WBA and number 10 by the WBC. Marvin Hagler was ranked number 8 by the WBC and the WBA. And there was a crowd of 14,930 spectators at the Philadelphia Spectrum. And believe it or not, it was a non-title fight. And you would think it was for the undisputed middleweight championship of the world. And that's what happens when you get great fighters who are willing to put themselves on the line to face one another. Because that's when boxing was boxing. That's when middleweights were middleweights. You had some great fights in 1978. Thanks for listening. Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. All great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. Salute to Bad Bennie Briscoe. Salute to marvelous Marvin Hagler.